The exact second Ilhan Omar labeled Dan Bongino a fascist bootlicker on a live television broadcast, she committed the precise kind of error that criminals make when they underestimate the investigator across the table. Dan Bongino had dedicated 11 years as a federal agent learning exactly how to exploit that specific mistake. She had arrived at the CBS studios for a special Face the Nation Unfiltered session, with the supreme confidence of a politician who had survived numerous public scandals. She had weathered accusations that would have terminated any other career, having learned that accusations of Islamophobia could effectively deflect almost any substantive criticism. She had meticulously prepared her talking points, rehearsed her expressions of indignation, and coordinated with her digital team for the perfect social media responses. Dan Bongino, however, had prepared in a fundamentally different way. As a former NYPD officer and Secret Service agent who had protected 3 different presidents, and a current media mogul built on direct confrontation, he brought his standard kit: verified receipts, documents, and hard facts. He utilized the investigative discipline of someone who had spent decades dealing with individuals who believed they could lie their way out of any situation. The events that unfolded over the subsequent hour would make Omar regret ever agreeing to the encounter, creating what would become the most watched political dismantling in the history of cable news. The studio audience was filled with 200 people, carefully balanced between conservative, liberal, and independent perspectives. Interestingly, producers had struggled to fill the progressive section, as it seemed even Omar's supporters were not eager to watch her face an opponent who arrived so thoroughly prepared. CBS had marketed the event for weeks as the Great American Debate on immigration, identity, and national security, promising fireworks. The network realized it would be explosive, but they had no idea of the actual magnitude. Backstage, the contrast between the two participants was unmistakable. Omar's team consisted of 5 people, including a communications director, a policy advisor, and a crisis management specialist. They huddled around her, frantically adjusting talking points and wargaming potential deflections in a tense, defensive atmosphere. Bongino sat entirely alone in his green room, reviewing digital notes on his iPad with no handlers or assistants. His years in the Secret Service had reinforced that the best preparation was individual. Know the facts, anticipate the deflections, and remain calm. Moderator Margaret Brennan sat backstage, questioning the career decisions that led her to this volatile moment. She was a serious journalist who preferred policy to personal hostility, and she knew this debate could be career-defining. As the audience settled, featuring a mix of political attire from MAGA hats to hijabs, the stage was set for the most watched political confrontation in modern memory. Brennan walked onto the stage to moderate applause and took her seat between the participants. The chairs were placed 6 feet apart, close enough for tension, but far enough to prevent physical contact. The lighting was dramatic, designed to capture every facial expression in high definition. Omar emerged first to mixed reactions. She wore a burgundy hijab and a navy blazer, an outfit carefully chosen to look professional and accessible. Strong, but not aggressive. She smiled at her supporters, gave a practiced wave, and settled in with the ease of a media veteran. She adjusted her microphone and looked at the camera with absolute confidence. This was her element: performance and narrative control. Bongino walked out 30 seconds later, a delay designed to build suspense. His reception was significantly louder, which visibly irritated Omar. He wore a dark, expensive suit, a red tie, and an American flag pin that caught the studio lights. He radiated the coiled energy of someone who had spent years ready to take a bullet for a president. He nodded to the crowd, gave a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes, and sat down, immediately locking direct, unwavering eye contact with Omar. She held his gaze for only 2 seconds before looking away, pretending to adjust her hijab. Bongino had secured the first psychological point. As the cameras went live to 14 million viewers, a number that would eventually reach 23 million, Brennan began her introduction. However, Omar immediately interrupted, pivoting to an offensive strategy. She stated that she found it deeply problematic that CBS chose to platform Dan Bongino, accusing him of spreading Islamophobic conspiracy theories and attacking Muslim members of Congress without accountability. She labeled him part of the fascist bootlicker wing of American politics. While she was mid-insult, Dan Bongino smiled. It was the smile of a federal agent watching a suspect incriminate themselves. "Thank you for that," he said in a thick New York accent. "I appreciate you establishing the tone so quickly. Now we can talk freely." The emphasis on freely made Omar's eyes narrow. She had tried to put him on the defensive, but she had actually given him permission to remove the gloves. Brennan tried to appeal for civility, but Bongino remained locked on Omar. "The Congresswoman just called me a fascist bootlicker on national television. That establishes the ground rules clearly." He leaned forward, adopting the posture of someone trained to identify danger. "Before we engage in name-calling, let me ask you about something you said on March 23, 2019, at a KIR event in Los Angeles. You were discussing the founding of the organization and stated that KIR was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that everyone was losing access to civil liberties." He paused, letting the quote hang. "Some people did something. That is how you describe the September 11th terrorist attacks." The studio went dead silent. Omar's face tightened as she claimed the quote was taken out of context. Bongino immediately countered, "I have the full video. Would you like me to play it?" Without waiting, he nodded to the booth. The screen showed Omar delivering the line with a dismissive shrug, treating 9/11 as a minor inconvenience rather than the deadliest attack in American history. Bongino's voice then dropped to a quieter, more dangerous register. "I was a Secret Service agent on September 11th, 2001. I was in New York, not far from Ground Zero. 19 al-Qaeda terrorists did something. They murdered Americans, flew planes into buildings, and killed firefighters, police officers, and passengers. They killed a friend of mine." His intensity increased. "I pulled people out of buildings that day. I attended funerals for months. And you called it, some people did something." Omar tried to argue she was making a point about civil liberties, but Bongino's controlled anger broke through. "By minimizing mass murder? By describing the worst terrorist attack in our history like a fender bender?" He stood up, making Brennan flinch. "I've worked security for 3 presidents and investigated terrorist plots. I've put my life on the line for this country more times than I can count, and you're going to sit there and call me a fascist while you minimize the murder of 3,000 Americans?" The audience erupted in applause and shouts. Bongino sat back down without breaking eye contact. Someone who minimizes 9/11 does not get to lecture anyone about patriotism. Someone who says some people did something has no moral authority to call anyone else a fascist. You are in Congress because America gave your family refuge from Somalia. America gave you safety, education, and opportunity. The absolute least you could do is respect our murdered. The following silence was absolute. Omar was reeling but tried to recover with her standard deflection, calling it a typical Islamophobic attack. Bongino interrupted cheerfully. "Let's talk about phobias. Let's talk about your documented problem with Jewish people." The realization of the trap crossed her face. Brennan tried to steer the conversation back to policy, but Bongino insisted he was discussing foreign policy and her statements regarding Israel. He pulled out his phone, citing her tweet from February 10th, 2019, where she wrote, "It's all about the Benjamin's baby." As the tweet appeared on screen, Bongino explained that it was a classic anti-Semitic trope, the idea that Jews use money to control policy. When Omar tried to claim she was criticizing AIPAC, Bongino scrolled to an older tweet from 2012 stating that Israel has hypnotized the world. He identified this as another anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. "You've compared Israel to Nazi Germany, supported the BDS movement, and questioned the loyalty of American Jews," Bongino noted. "Your own party passed resolutions condemning your statements twice. Not Republicans, your own party." Omar's face was flushed. She began to say she had Jewish friends, but Bongino stopped her. "Having Jewish friends is not a defense. If I tweeted it's all about the welfare when discussing a program you support, what would you call me? If I said Somalia had hypnotized its diaspora, what would you call me? You'd call me a racist, and you'd be right. But when you do it to Jews, you call it policy criticism and hide behind Islamophobia. That's anti-Semitism, and everyone knows it." Bongino's voice softened but became more cutting. "You came here as a refugee. You know what refugees were fleeing in the 1940s? The Holocaust. Jewish refugees fleeing genocide. They came here just like your family did. And you attacked them using the same conspiracy theories that got 6 million of them murdered. That isn't Islamophobia, Congresswoman. That is accountability. Margaret Brennan was noticeably struggling to maintain any semblance of control over the explosive debate, but the live television ratings were reaching unprecedented levels. The producers were likely instructing her to let the confrontation proceed. Recognizing the shift, the Congresswoman attempted a different tactic, pivoting toward a narrative of victimhood regarding attacks on Muslims in America. Dan Bongino immediately redirected the focus. "Let us discuss immigration," he stated. "Since you are such a vocal advocate for open borders and frequently lecture the nation about compassion for immigrants, we should examine your own record." He reached under his chair and produced a physical folder. This was not a thin or superficial file. It was a thick, expansive dossier, the type utilized by law enforcement for complex investigations involving multiple documents, forensic photos, and detailed timelines. The Congresswoman's eyes immediately went to the folder with the unmistakable look of a suspect eyeing evidence they believed had been permanently suppressed. "You legally married a man named Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi in 2009. Is that correct?" Bongino asked as he opened the file. When she began to protest that her personal life was not relevant, Bongino cut her off. "You are a public official who lectures the American public on immigration policy. Therefore, your personal immigration history is fundamentally relevant. So, answer clearly, did you marry Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi in 2009? She eventually confirmed the marriage but attempted to add a qualification. Bongino pushed forward. "And you were already religiously married to Ahmed Hirsi at that exact time, correct? Your first husband." The studio audience audibly gasped. This was entering investigative territory that mainstream media outlets had largely avoided for years. "That was a religious union, not a legal one," she replied quickly. "Let us examine the actual timeline," Bongino said, pulling out a stack of documents and putting on his reading glasses. "Because the chronology is fascinating. In 2002, you entered a religious marriage with Ahmed Hirsi and had 2 children. In 2008, you separated. In 2009, you legally married Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi. But here's the interesting part. He pulled out property records from 2011 and 2012. While you were legally married to Elmi, you were physically living with Hirsi. You were photographed together at various public events, you had additional children together, and public records show you residing at the exact same address." More documents emerged from the thick folder. In 2017, you filed for divorce from Elmi, but claimed you could not locate him for the legal proceedings. Your own attorney stated they had not seen him in years. Where exactly did your legal husband go, Congresswoman? She was visibly gripping the arms of her chair. In 2018, you finally legally married Hirsi, formalizing what had been your actual relationship for years. In 2019, you divorced him. And in 2020, you married your campaign consultant, Tim Minot. Bongino set the timeline down and looked directly at her. Now, here is what multiple investigations by conservative media, Minnesota state agencies, and campaign finance boards have formally alleged: that Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi is actually your biological brother. The audience erupted in shock. Brennan appeared ready to cut to a commercial break, but the tension held the room. "That is a disgusting and baseless smear," she declared. "Then prove the allegations wrong," Bongino replied calmly. "Provide the public with Elmi's birth certificate, release his immigration records, or simply take a DNA test to end the speculation. You won't do it because the evidence compiled against you is overwhelming." He began displaying printed screenshots from social media and public records. "We have photos of you and Elmi as children in Somalia. We have school records listing the same parents. We have family members referring to him as your brother in posts that were later deleted. We have immigration documents with glaring irregularities and a birth date that suspiciously matches your brother's known data." He spread the evidence across the table. "The allegation is that you married your biological brother to commit federal immigration fraud, either to secure his entry into the country or to obtain legal status for him. Before you label this a conspiracy theory, remember that immigration fraud is a severe federal crime. I personally investigated such cases in law enforcement. You want to abolish ICE and have no enforcement, yet you won't answer basic questions about your own potential fraud. That is not advocacy. It is profound hypocrisy. Desperate to move to safer ground, the Congresswoman pleaded to discuss actual policy. Bongino agreed with false enthusiasm. Let us discuss your policy of utilizing campaign funds like a personal ATM. He pulled out a new folder labeled FEC filings. Your current husband, Tim Minett, operates a consulting firm called the E Street Group. Exactly how much has your campaign paid his firm? When she hesitated and noted that campaigns hire consultants routinely, Bongino provided the answer. That information is public record. It is $2.8 million. Your campaign has funneled nearly $3 million to your husband's firm. As shocked murmurs spread through the crowd, Bongino detailed the narrative. In 2018, Minett began consulting for you while you were both married to other people. In 2019, his wife filed for divorce, alleging he confessed to an affair with you. In 2020, you married him. From 2020 to 2024, his firm received millions in donor money. He pulled out highlighted spreadsheets. Travel expenses to his firm, $780,000. Consulting fees, $1.2 million. Media production, $650,000. Some of these expenses occurred in cities where you were together: hotels, meals, and luxury stays. The Minnesota Campaign Finance Board already fined you for using campaign funds for personal expenses and improper tax filings. You paid a fine of $3,469, which is a tacit admission of guilt, yet you never explained it to your constituents. You run on getting money out of politics and attacking corporate influence, yet you are enriching your own family with donor contributions. That is not public service. It is self-service. You are not fighting corruption. You embody it. Brennan attempted to shift the topic to foreign policy and national security. Perfect, Bongino said. Let us discuss the Congresswoman's unique perspective on global terrorism. He cited a 2019 interview where she discussed her college experience. You stated that your professor framed terrorism as occasions when victims of Western imperialism decided to do something. But the most revealing part was that you used physical air quotes when saying the names Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah, as if they were not real threats but merely Western fabrications. The video played on the screen behind them, showing her making the gestures. The reaction was visceral. Gasps and angry mutters filled the room. Air quotes for the organization that murdered 3,000 Americans on 9/11, Bongino said, his voice hardening. They killed my friend and 343 firefighters, and you treat them like a fictional boogeyman. He switched the screen to images of Hezbollah attacks. Hezbollah murdered 241 U.S. Marines in Beirut. They are a designated terrorist organization, yet you use air quotes. You weren't just describing a view, you were agreeing with it. You suggested terrorism is a justified response. He then addressed her 2022 trip to Somalia. You returned to your homeland and addressed large crowds. But you didn't meet with victims of al-Shabaab or talk about the Americans they have killed. Instead, you held nationalist rallies. When you returned, you told your constituents to ask us what country we are from, suggesting your primary identity is Somali rather than American. You took an oath to defend the Constitution, yet you identify with a foreign nation first. You minimize those who kill Americans and compare the United States to Hamas and the Taliban. Whose side are you actually on? The silence that followed was absolute. Omar attempted one last defense, claiming she loved the country. Bongino laughed incredulously. Really? Show us one single instance where you defended or praised America without immediately attacking it or adding a, however. I will wait. The silence stretched for 10 long seconds on live television as she struggled to find an answer. Of course you can't, Bongino concluded. Your entire brand is built on resentment and grievance against the country that saved you. You don't love America, you resent the fact that you needed it. In a final, unscripted move, Bongino stood and walked to center stage. You have hidden behind accusations of racism for 6 years to avoid accountability. Tonight, that ends. He recited the oath of office from memory. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. He looked directly at her. Have you kept it? You minimized 9/11. You spread anti-Semitism. You potentially committed immigration fraud and definitely violated campaign laws. You justified terrorism and demonstrated divided loyalty. You attack America every day while enjoying its benefits. Every oath you took, you broke. He turned to the camera. I have protected presidents and investigated terrorists. I can say with absolute certainty, she is in Congress, but she is not of America. She does not share our values. She does not honor her oath, and she does not love this country. The studio audience, predominantly the conservative half and many independents, rose in a sustained standing ovation. Margaret Brennan had completely lost control of the broadcast. Bongino delivered his final line. You took an oath to defend America, but you have spent 6 years attacking it. Americans now see exactly who you are. The Congresswoman sat in her chair, a mask of stunned defeat. She could not cry Islamophobia because Bongino had used her own words. She could not cry racism because he had cited public records. She had nothing left. The clip of the 10-second silence and the oath recitation garnered 94 million views within 48 hours. Whose side are you on? Became a national rallying cry. The political fallout was immediate. The House Ethics Committee opened an investigation into her finances, and 3 Democratic challengers announced primary campaigns against her. Her approval ratings plummeted by 23 points. Democratic leadership publicly distanced themselves, and she was eventually removed from the Foreign Affairs Committee. She stopped appearing on live television, retreating to the safety of curated social media spaces. Dan Bongino, meanwhile, became a conservative icon. His ratings and podcast numbers skyrocketed. His evidence-based approach became a template for Republican officials. Prepare thoroughly, bring documentation, and never back down when accused of bigotry for stating the truth. Ultimately, this was not just a partisan battle. It was a fundamental question of national loyalty and gratitude. Dan Bongino proved that citizens do not have to stay silent in the face of false narratives. He brought the receipts, and the silence of Ilhan Omar was the loudest answer the country had ever received. The era of vague emotional appeals was ending, replaced by a rigorous demand for factual integrity. When the broadcast ended, the country didn't need a moderator to declare a winner. The record and the broken oath spoke for themselves. If you believe that representatives should truly love and defend America, share this story. The oath of office is a sacred trust, and those who break it must be held accountable. Dan Bongino asked the question that matters most, and the receipts he brought told a story every American needs to hear. The great American debate was over, but the pursuit of accountability had only just begun. The confrontation intensified as Dan Bongino transitioned from her personal immigration history to a forensic examination of her financial records. He reached for a fresh folder, this one prominently marked with FEC filings, a move that signaled a shift into the realm of campaign finance law. Let us discuss your public stance on ethics, Bongino proposed, his voice carrying the rhythmic weight of a veteran investigator. You have built a political brand on the idea of removing corporate influence and dark money from the halls of power. You frequently describe yourself as a reformer, a champion for the working class who is untainted by the standard corruption of Washington. However, your own mandatory financial disclosures tell a remarkably different story. He opened the folder and began itemizing payments made by the Congresswoman's official campaign to the E Street Group, a consulting firm. This firm is owned and operated by your current husband, Tim Minot. According to verified public records, your campaign has funneled approximately $2.8 million to this single entity. To provide the American people with the proper perspective, that is nearly $3 million in donor funds, money provided by everyday citizens who believed their contributions were supporting a grassroots movement, going directly into a business controlled by your own spouse. Bongino laid out a series of spreadsheets on the table, highlighting specific expenditure categories. The breakdown of these payments is even more revealing. We see $780,000 listed for travel expenses, $1.2 million for general consulting fees, and $650,000 for media production. More curiously, $420,000 was allocated for fundraising consulting. In multiple instances, these travel expenses coincided with dates and locations where you were physically present for personal reasons. We are looking at luxury hotel stays and premium dining billed to the campaign. In any other professional environment, using donor money as a private family slush fund would be categorized as a conflict of interest at best and blatant fraud at worst. The Congresswoman attempted to interject, stating that the Federal Election Commission, FEC, had reviewed her records. Bongino did not yield the floor. The Minnesota Campaign Finance Board did more than just review them. They formally issued a fine. He countered, holding up the documentation. You were ordered to pay $3,469 for the improper use of campaign funds and for filing fraudulent tax returns. While you may view that amount as minor, the principle is absolute. You were found guilty of violating the rules you claim to want to strengthen. You paid the fine quietly, hoping the news cycle would move on, but the pattern has continued. Even in the most recent quarterly filings, thousands of dollars continue to flow from your campaign directly to your husband's firm. This is not advocacy for reform, it is a highly efficient system of self-enrichment. The debate then pivoted to the highly sensitive area of national security and the Congresswoman's past statements regarding international terrorism. Margaret Brennan attempted to frame the discussion around Middle East policy, but Bongino redirected the inquiry toward a 2019 interview that had long been a point of contention for many Americans. Let us examine your specific perspective on organizations that have declared war on this country, Bongino said, his tone becoming dangerously quiet. In a recorded interview discussing your education, you described a terrorism class where the professor supposedly nuanced the actions of Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah. You stated, and I am quoting you directly, that these groups were simply victims of Western imperialism who decided to do something. Bongino signaled the booth, and the video played on the overhead monitors. The audience watched as she mentioned Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah while physically making air quotes with her fingers. The reaction in the room was a mixture of audible gasps and sharp, angry whispers. Air quotes, Bongino repeated, the disgust evident in his expression. As if these are not real organizations with real victims. As if the nearly 3,000 Americans murdered on September 11th were killed by a semantic misunderstanding. Al-Qaeda is a designated terrorist group that took the life of a personal friend of mine. They killed 343 firefighters in New York. Hezbollah has the blood of hundreds of U.S. Marines on its hands. By using air quotes, you are suggesting that their status as terrorists is a matter of Western opinion, rather than a factual reality of their violence. He pushed further into her record, addressing her 2022 visit to Somalia. You returned to your homeland and were greeted with the fanfare of a celebrity. You held rallies and spoke passionately about Somali nationalism. However, it is a matter of record that during that trip, you did not meet with a single victim of Al-Shabaab, the terrorist group currently ravaging your country of birth. You did not speak for the aid workers they have slaughtered or the Americans they have targeted. Instead, you returned to this country and told your American constituents, "Ask us what country we are from." That statement suggests that you do not view yourself as an American legislator first, but as a representative of a foreign interest who happens to hold a seat in our Congress. The Congresswoman gripped the podium, her posture rigid. She attempted to claim that she loved the United States and was honored by the opportunities it provided her. This prompted Dan Bongino's most famous challenge of the evening. He laughed, a cold, incredulous sound. You love this country? Then I challenge you, right now in front of this live audience and millions of people watching at home. Show us. Name one single time in your 6 years in office where you have stood at a microphone and praised America without immediately qualified it with an attack. Name one time you defended our nation without adding a but or a however regarding our supposed systemic racism or imperialism. I will sit here and wait for that one positive statement. What followed was 10 seconds of absolute, deafening silence. The Congresswoman opened her mouth, closed it, and looked down at her notes, searching for a quote that apparently did not exist. The cameras stayed on her face, capturing every second of the struggle. For a politician known for her rapid-fire rhetoric and media savvy, The inability to name one moment of unalloyed gratitude for the country that gave her refuge was a devastating admission. "Of course you cannot," Bongino finally said, breaking the silence. "Because your entire brand is built on the narrative of grievance. You present yourself as a victim of the very nation that provided you with safety, education, and the highest levels of political power. You do not love America. You deeply resent that you needed it." In the final unscripted moments of the debate, Bongino stood up and walked to the center of the stage, bypassing the moderator. He looked directly at the Congresswoman and began to recite the congressional oath of office from memory. "I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same." He paused and leaned in. "Have you kept that oath? You minimized the 9/11 attacks. You utilized anti-Semitic tropes to attack our allies. You committed tax fraud. You funneled millions in donor money to your own family. You justified global terrorism as a response to imperialism. And you explicitly told Americans to question your national loyalty. You have broken every part of that sacred trust." He turned away from her and looked directly into the camera. "I have served this nation for decades. I have protected presidents and investigated those who wish us harm, and I can say with absolute factual certainty, Ilhan Omar is in the Congress, but she is not of America. She does not share our foundational values, she does not honor her sworn oath, and she clearly does not love this country. She is here to exploit our freedoms while attacking the foundations that make those freedoms possible." The studio audience, which had been tense for an hour, erupted into a thunderous standing ovation for Bongino. Even members of the audience who had arrived as skeptics were seen standing, moved by the raw intensity and documented evidence of the dismantling. Margaret Brennan had completely lost control of the proceedings. The broadcast was no longer a debate, but a public trial where the verdict was written in the silence of the accused. Bongino's final line, "Americans finally see exactly who you are," echoed through the studio as the Congresswoman sat motionless, her face a mask of stunned defeat. The aftermath of the debate was a political tsunami. Within 48 hours, the clip of her 10-second silence had been viewed 94 million times across social media. The hashtag, "Whose side are you on?" became the dominant trend in American politics. The political fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the Congresswoman. The House Ethics Committee formally opened a comprehensive investigation into her campaign finance practices, citing the specific documents Bongino had produced. Her approval ratings in Minnesota plummeted, and 3 separate Democratic challengers announced primary campaigns against her, with one Somali-American leader stating that she had fundamentally embarrassed their community. Dan Bongino emerged from the encounter as a definitive force in conservative media. His investigative methodology, relying on receipts and a refusal to be silenced by accusations of bigotry, became the new gold standard for holding extremist politicians accountable. The debate proved that the era of vague emotional appeals was ending, replaced by a rigorous, evidence-based demand for national loyalty and ethical integrity. Ultimately, the Great American Debate was remembered not for what was said, but for what could not be answered. The record of the Congresswoman and her broken oath remained as the final, unchangeable evidence of a career that had finally met the wall of factual accountability. The profound resonance of this confrontation extended far beyond the immediate shock of the live broadcast. As the studio lights dimmed and the production crew began the process of striking the set, the reality of what had transpired began to settle into the collective consciousness of the American public. This was not merely a television event, it was a forensic autopsy of a political career. The silence that Ilhan Omar had maintained for those 10 agonizing seconds was being replayed in homes, coffee shops, and offices across the nation. It was a silence that spoke of a fundamental disconnection between an elected representative and the nation she was sworn to serve. To understand the full magnitude of the fallout, one must look at the specific investigative details that Dan Bongino introduced in the final stages of the debate. When he spoke of the receipts, he was referring to a level of documentation that left no room for the standard political maneuvers of evasion or counter-accusation. In the days following the broadcast, independent forensic accountants began to verify the campaign finance records Bongino had presented. The $2.8 million funneled to the E Street Group was not just a single data point. It was a map of a sophisticated financial operation. Analysts pointed out that the media production and travel expenses were billed at rates significantly higher than industry standards, raising further questions about the ultimate destination of those donor funds. The investigative files also shed new light on the 2009 marriage allegations. For years, these claims had been dismissed by mainstream outlets as conspiracy theories. But the public records Bongino produced, including the matching birth dates and the shared residential history with her first husband while legally married to the second, forced a re-evaluation. The Minnesota state agencies, which had previously remained quiet due to political sensitivities, found themselves under immense public pressure to release the full findings of their inquiries. The Great American Debate had effectively broken the seal on information that had been suppressed for over half a decade. The cultural impact was perhaps even more devastating than the legal implications. In the Somali American community of Minneapolis, a silent but powerful shift was occurring. Leaders who had once supported the Congresswoman out of a sense of communal solidarity began to express their disillusionment. They saw that her actions had brought a negative spotlight onto their community, complicating the lives of legitimate refugees who were working hard to integrate and contribute to American society. A prominent community elder noted that by potentially gaming the immigration system, she had undermined the very path that so many others had taken with honesty and sacrifice. Veterans organizations across the country also reacted with a unified voice of condemnation. The air quotes regarding Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah were viewed as a direct insult to every individual who had worn the uniform and every family who had received a folded flag. For these Americans, the 9/11 attacks and the Beirut barracks bombing were not nuanced historical events to be framed by academic theories of imperialism. They were moments of profound national tragedy and personal loss. Bongino's status as a former Secret Service agent gave him the standing to articulate this pain, and his words acted as a bridge for millions of citizens who felt their sacrifices were being minimized by the political elite. On the legislative front, the House Foreign Affairs Committee's decision to remove her was just the beginning. The bipartisan vote reflected a growing consensus that national security matters required a level of loyalty and discretion that she had failed to demonstrate. Colleagues from both sides of the aisle privately admitted that the debate had made it impossible to maintain the status quo. The Squad, once seen as an untouchable vanguard of progressive politics, suddenly found its influence significantly curtailed. The debate had proven that identity politics and accusations of bigotry were no longer sufficient to stop a factual investigation. The media landscape itself underwent a transformation. Outlets that had spent years protecting the Congresswoman were forced into a defensive posture. The 10 seconds of silence became a case study in journalism schools, used to illustrate the power of a simple, direct question when backed by evidence. Dan Bongino's approach, the Bongino method, was adopted by a new generation of conservative commentators and investigators. It shifted the focus away from ideological bickering and toward a rigorous, document-based scrutiny of public officials. The era of vague accusations was being replaced by the era of the receipts. In the weeks that followed, the hashtag #TheOathYouBroke continued to trend, evolving into a broader movement demanding a loyalty audit for all federal officials. Voters began to ask their representatives to explicitly state their commitment to the Constitution and to provide transparent accounts of their financial ties. The debate had sparked a national conversation about the true meaning of representation. It asked whether a legislator's primary duty was to a global movement, a foreign identity, or to the American citizens who paid their salary and trusted them with their future. As for Dan Bongino, the encounter cemented his role as the preeminent voice of accountability in the media. His refusal to be intimidated by the Congresswoman's accusations of fascism, or bigotry, served as a blueprint for others. He proved that when the truth is grounded in verified documents and public records, it possesses an inherent power that can dismantle even the most carefully constructed political brand. He did not need to shout or utilize hyperbole. The facts, delivered with the discipline of a federal agent, were more than enough. The final image that stayed with the American people was the contrast between the two chairs on that CBS stage. In one sat a woman who had arrived with a team of handlers, a rehearsed script, and a shield of victimhood, only to find that none of it could protect her from her own record. In the other sat a man who had arrived alone, armed only with the truth, and who had walked out to the cheers of a crowd that finally felt heard. The great American debate did not end when the cameras stopped rolling. It ended when the American people realized they no longer had to accept the narratives being forced upon them. The silence of Ilhan Omar on that Tuesday evening in May 2026 was the sound of a political era coming to an end. It was the moment when the receipts were finally presented and the balance was due. The story of this debate will be told for decades, not as a partisan victory, but as a victory for basic honesty, national loyalty, and the sacred nature of the oath of office. If you believe that those who lead this nation should love this nation, then the lesson of this encounter is clear. Accountability is not an option. It is a requirement. Dan Bongino asked the question that defined a generation of politics, and the answer remains etched in the historical record for all to see. This concludes the forensic examination of the political dismantling of Ilhan Omar. It serves as a permanent reminder that in a free society, the truth eventually finds its way to the surface, and when it does, no amount of rhetoric can hide the reality of a broken trust. God bless the citizens who demand the truth, and God bless the nation that is strong enough to face it.